Please welcome Yair Attar, CTO and co-founder at Otorio. Yair will be presenting Shared Responsibility in DCS/SCADA, Challenges and Actionable Strategies.
Thank you, appreciate that. So last day, I hope everyone, it was successful so far, and hopefully the last few hours. But anyway, I'm going to talk today with you about cybersecurity within those complex supply chain environments where we have different providers, system integrators, product suppliers, when we're talking about DCS, SCADA mainly, and the challenges in those environments, trying to raise some awareness, and who should own what. It's not very clear, I must admit. And hopefully you're going to get some insights, tools, and capabilities. So we're going to go over a very quick review of some terminology, talk about really the challenges in securing those types of environments, understanding those responsibilities, and based on different frameworks, and also hopefully provide you some tools and capabilities. So just to level set, I think it's clear, DCS, distributed control system, really it's a complex system comprised out of multiple different solutions, products, devices that sometimes are even third-party systems, multiple communication protocols, sometimes very proprietary protocols, different programs or applications, a lot of monitoring events for different types of equipment, and basically integrated multiple types of assets and solutions or applications within this system. SCADA, basically, to some extent, you can say a smaller, from capabilities perspective, of a DCS, but similar in many ways, usually costs a bit less. And I would say that it's also widely common in different more geographically spread environments. We see it a lot in utilities and energy and those types of environments. And again, I would say it has a lot of similarities, but maybe some limited capabilities compared to DCS systems. Now, when we are looking at those types of environments from an attacker point of view, then usually what we see is, one, still there's a lot of IT technologies, so Windows machines and network devices, because usually those systems are comprised or situated within a higher level within the Purdue model. Okay, so if we look at the Purdue model, usually between level 3 to level 2, and sometimes within the DMZ, some capabilities will be published. And those are still very critical systems. A lot of the times when working with different customers, and you're going to see them saying that their controllers or RTUs or end devices at the lower levels are very critical for them because they really touch the physical process. But at the end of the day, those DCS and SCADA systems are the ones that managing the whole process completely. When we're looking at different attacks that happened in the past, so when we're looking about Triton, and yes, usually when we're going down to those types of level, we do talk about nation states usually, or things that are a bit more, I would say, complex from an attacker point of view. But we do see that even Triton, there was a focus and a capability to actually manipulate the DCS system. At the end, they went for the safety controllers, but just as an example. So let's talk about challenges and responsibilities when we are talking about cybersecurity. So first of all, again, it's a complete system that comprises of multiple endpoints, servers, users, applications for different purposes. And each and every device can have different configurations on an application level, on an infrastructure level. We're talking about lots of network devices, so switches, but also firewalls. And there's a possibility to leverage that from a network segmentation and segregation perspective. And when we are talking about things like additional third-party software. So whether those are OPC, that is quite common. Some providers provide it with some controls, like Active Directory, and sometimes even security controls, like endpoint protection of their own, because this is how they validate that, yes, this works. So again, it's a complete, I would say, mixture of technologies, applications, solutions within one big system. So it's hard to say who's responsible for that. Is it the product supplier, like the automation OEM that builds it, Siemens, Schneider Electric, GE? Is it the system integrator that actually is the one that comes to my site and end-to-end do the implementation and configuration and all those things? Or is it the asset owner, the ones that actually manage and responsible for the ongoing operations? So I have a quick question to you. And please raise your hand to the relevant answer that you think, and there's no right or wrong answer. But who thinks it's the product supplier responsibility? The Siemens, the Schneiders, the General Electric. Who thinks it's the system integrator responsibility? Who thinks it's the asset owner responsibility? Interesting. So even some of you, I think I saw raising their hands twice, which is, by the way, is OK, because again, there's no strict line into who's responsible for what. Let's talk about a few examples before we go into solutions or options, how to handle that. So PCS 7, from a deployment perspective. So you can find online their setup guide, a very detailed information on how to install their DCS application, the DCS system. And if you're going to go into the details, you're actually going to see that they are recommending that the project file folder, from permission perspective, will be open to everyone. This is within the setup guide. So when we saw that, we thought maybe we are the crazy ones, that maybe it's OK. So we actually looked it up, and we actually saw a lot of talks about it, people mentioning it, some people saying, again, you need it. Some people say, but it's a risk. So again, we're not the only ones. And we actually approached this to Siemens, and they were quite good enough to add it in their security guide. Now, a lot of vendors have a lot of security guides, but it's an additional guide that is not part of the setup guide officially. So is it optional? Because it's not part of the setup guide. It's not something that say this is something you need to do. And also another thing that's interesting, because they will not announce on this gap or exposure, because it's not a vulnerability. They're not obliged to do this level of announcement, because it's not a bug. It's a feature, right? So it's up to the end user or the system integrator to decide if they want to use it or not. So nobody knows, if they're going to the setup guide, that this needs to be done. Another example from communication or basically encryption perspective. So ABB 800XA. So we saw that basically communication is unencrypted. And they're saying this is the responsibility of the end user to, those are trusted zones. And it's the responsibility of the end user to make sure that they're creating a tunnel. Interesting enough, the same exact use case with GE, they actually treated it as a vulnerability and announced about it and created a fix for that. So just to show again, same, I would say, security gap or feature or bug or whatever you want to call it, different ways of treating it from different types of vendors. Let's talk about another example, SBOM, which is a challenging topic. So regarding SBOM, Siemens are announcing that ALM, the Automation License Manager, is quite an integral part of their solution stack. And interesting enough, we found a few vulnerabilities in the ALM, and they provided some fixes. Again, for some versions, unfortunately, there's no fix. But they're not saying which products are affected. How do I know, the end user, that I have SIMATIC or something else or whatever, that I need to act on that? Because this is an internal software they use within my full DCS system. What's also interesting that we found about 11 years ago, when they had a vulnerability on the ALM, they actually announced the affected products. By the way, I don't know if there's anyone from Siemens here, and sorry for picking on them, but they're actually quite, I must admit, they're quite good from a security perspective. They're much more responsive than a lot of the vendors we are working with, and they're actually doing a lot in announcing and to the public of things that they are happening than most of the vendors that we work with. So when we are talking about secure deployment, right? So usually what we see is that the software supplier, the product supplier, are providing security features, security guidelines. And the asset owners and integrators are basically responsible for the implementation and assessing of those environments. But no one should assume that secure comes by default. And I think that even more than that, what you usually say, it's yes, maybe it's secure by design, but it doesn't mean that it's secure in practice. So let's talk about shared responsibility. So it's not just in OT, it's not invented in OT. There are other places where we see shared responsibility. I think in the cloud or IT, it's actually quite clear. There's a very differentiation between, like a big differentiation between whether it's a SaaS, PaaS, IaaS, on-prem, who's responsible for the infrastructure, for up to what level of the application. So again, it's not a unique use case to OT that shared responsibility or multiple organizations or service providers or product owners are have some responsibility, and to what extent. When we look at the IEC 62443, which is widely used a lot more, I think, in Europe, but in general, I think it's a very detailed standard that takes other standards to the next level from the level of details. And it's interesting to see, by the way, that a lot of the vendors are very proud and happy to be certified, whether they have here, like from ABB and Emerson and Honeywell and everyone. But what's interesting is that although the DCS or SCADA system is certified, it doesn't mean it's going to be secured. What we saw even in some of the DCS applications or systems is that even though it's certified, in order to enforce all security measures, some of the product capabilities will not work. So yes, they have the option to secure it and be compliant, but to be honest, in reality, I don't think in most cases everything is really configured to what extent. Now, interesting enough, the IEC 62443 actually provides some guidelines or breakdown of shared responsibility with those different stakeholders, from the asset owners, the maintenance service provider, the integration service provider, and the product supplier. And they even create the workflows of who needs to do what, how the process and journey needs to look like. So it's a very detailed process. And maybe to try and summarize it, is that the product supplier is really responsible to provide those options, those security configurations, the possibility to make it secure, is responsible for providing updates whenever there's a new gap, a new vulnerability, and it's also responsible to identify SBOM risks, the packages, the software that he uses. Whereas the system integrators are responsible for basically the designing and the implementation of those guidelines, and to verify that those are being met. But it's also the asset owner responsibility to ask for those things. Let me tell you, as a commercial organization, usually, most people, or in the business world, most people will not do extra work if they're not being asked to do. So the asset owner, from awareness perspective, and this is critical, needs to know what to ask, needs to edit whether this is from procurement perspective, from legal perspective, when they're choosing vendors. So this is really, really important. And at the end of the day, once things are being deployed, to have this assessed once every time. And by the way, it doesn't mean that they cannot go to a service provider that will provide this as a service. But again, the responsibility to maintain this ongoingly. So something that we actually released, and I invite everyone who wants to go and download it. Basically, based on best practices and the research we've done, we created sort of like a checklist that you can go and use it by yourself that hopefully can help you ask the right questions, talk to your vendors from any angle of the supply chain, and be more aware of the things that you should ask, with also examples from the different DCS and SCADA applications. So again, something that once we did this research, and from our experience working with those vendors and end users, something we wanted to contribute to here. This is a completely open source. It's a checklist that you can do whatever you want with it, and also we're more than welcoming everyone to support if they have any suggestions or recommendations. Now, it's not just checklists. Actually, along our work in the last few years, we even released a few tools, automated tools, that are doing basically hardening configuration checks. They're not doing the hardening itself, but automatically, once you run them on those different systems, they're actually going to show you all the gaps based on the best practices of the vendor and their guidelines, just in an automated fashion. So we see here Siemens PCS7, GE Simplicity, things like DCOM hardening toolkit. So different tools that we, again, provided as open source, and there are more to come. And again, one thing to remember, it's not just those systems, but there are also third-party applications or systems that sometimes the customer wants to apply to the network, whether it's Active Directory or those types of things. So we need to remember it's a systems of systems, you could say, that is more than just this DCS or SCADA application. So to try and summarize what we discussed is that I would say, although it's very clear about things that needs to be done, it's not that easy. Compliant product versus compliant integrator. So it could be that the product itself is compliant, but the integrator is not aware of how to do that. Is this exists within the service providers or system integrators we are working with? Some things that we need to check and validate. Security measures upon requirement. Again, we need to know what to ask. If nobody's asking, and there's a lot of times, especially when we're going to procurement processes, right? Procurement wants to get the lowest bidder. And we need to start creating awareness and understand everyone as a community that we need to push this to happen, because otherwise we might pay later much more. We also need to, what should reassess from a security cover, right? We need to define ourselves as an organization, what's important for us. It doesn't mean that everything needs to be secure to 100%. Maybe there are some criteria that are more important for us, and those things we want to enforce our suppliers, or we want to work with our suppliers, or we want to check our suppliers. Clarifying the ASBOM responsibility. It's also something that's not always very clear. Whether, for example, the vendor just published on his website that there is something and it's your responsibility as end users to go and find and read it, or that they are obliged to send you some notifications. So know that, understand that with working with your supplier, so you'll have the understanding of what needs to be done and how those things should work. And what should be delivered as part of an update, whether you are doing some refreshments and things like that. What do you expect your vendors, your suppliers to do? So I think really at the end of the day, there's no clear cut, unfortunately. There are suggestions. It doesn't mean, by the way, that this is the only way forward. But I do have a question to you. My last question for today is, based on what you saw right now, did any of you change even a bit your minds regarding that who's responsible for the cybersecurity of those types of solutions? Anybody learn something new that maybe changed a bit his mind? Good. So I'm happy to see that some of you did, because again, unfortunately, there's no clear cut in these lines of responsibility. But it is my goal here today is to create better awareness around that. And again, it's not just technology. It goes to procurement processes, it goes to legal, it goes to many other aspects that it's our responsibility as practitioners to make sure that they are aware. You cannot expect everyone to be aware of this and just add it to those processes. So thank you very much, and I don't know if there are any questions, then this is the time. Although I think it was quite straightforward, then it really makes sense. And of course, if there are any more questions, our booth is right out there. I thank you very much, and have a great rest of the conference.